Psychology and Sociology MCAT Review, Lecture 2. This is an audio lecture of my shorthand notes for Lecture 2. 2.1 Introduction. Standards of behavior make establishment of culture and society possible. Both large and individual interactions are important in establishing these standards of behavior. 2.2 Classical Conditioning. First, behavioral conditioning, or associative learning or conditioning. Classical conditioning and operant conditioning are the two subsets of behavioral conditioning. Classical conditioning can be given through the example of Pavlov's dogs. Development of response association with associated stimulus with another stimuli that is already elicited to that response. The unconditioned stimulus, dogs innately salivate when presented with food. This is the unconditioned response. The neutral stimulus is when the dog sees the food in the bowl and did not elicit a response, only when presented with the food. Conditioned stimulus, the bell ringing, before feeding, time salivate whenever bell rung, whether or not food presented, or conditioned response. Extra fun fact, drug addicts report this, avoiding old haunts so they will not relapse due to anticipation. This is also the reason why overdose usually occurs when a person's body is not conditioned for a response in the area. Honestly, this happens in my room with my internet addiction. Next, acquisition. The stage in which learning a conditioned response to a new stimulus over time. Next vocabulary term, extinction. The disappearance of a conditioned response after a period of extinction called spontaneous recovery. The dog is no longer getting the food when the bell rings and thus no longer salivates. Stimulus generalization. When playing an American crow sound and a Western raven sound, the dog responds similarly when salivating. Stimulus discrimination. The learned lack of response to stimulus similar to the conditioned stimulus. Feeding to the crow sound but not the raven means there will be different rates of salivation. Example of classical conditioning. Classical conditioning and association used by advertisers. Used to encourage consumers to build up positive associations with a brand. Think, my mother and Coca-Cola. Can also build negative emotions. Think, 9/11, news reporting, and discrimination against Islam by United States at large. Next term, operant conditioning. Associative learning in which an individual becomes more or less likely to carry out a certain behavior based on its consequences. This is associated with Skinner. Skinner is associated with operational conditioning. The Skinner box. Food is only dispersed to rats that carry out a specific behavior, such as pushing a lever for food, or reinforcement. Shocking the rat only when a certain part of the box is occupied by the rat, caused avoidance of the area, or punishment. Positive reinforcement. Reinforcing stimulus to a certain behavior. Example, money to take out the trash. Negative reinforcement. Removal of an unpleasant stimulus. Scolding to take out the trash. Positive punishment. Negative consequence, a stimulus right after the behavior. Example, parents scolding because staying past curfew. Negative punishment. A response cost. Instead of giving a punishment, you take something away. Staying past curfew means no phone for a week. Primary reinforcer. Food delivery. Primary punisher. Exposure to extreme temperatures. Primary is all about survival. Secondary reinforcer. Money, praise, prestige, good grades. Secondary punisher. Fines, scolding, ostracism, bad grades. Secondary requires learning of the social context. Escape conditioning, mouse avoiding one side of the cage. Avoidance conditioning, Whistle blowing means one side of the cage will be shocked. Hear whistle, will move over. Learn behavior to avoid a response. Reinforcement schedule. How often and under what conditions a behavior is reinforced. How often and under what conditions the behavior is reinforced. Partial reinforcement or intermittent reinforcement. Mouse is only rewarded sometimes when pressing the lever. Schedules for partial reinforcement. Schedule 1. Fixed ratio. Rewards are provided after a specified number of responses. Example, the rat presses the lever 3 times to get food. Again, this is fixed ratio. Second schedule for partial reinforcement. Variable ratio. Rewards are provided after an unpredictable number of responses. Example, reward for pressing a lever 3 times, 2 times, or 4 times. An example of this is slot machines. Again, this is variable ratio. Fixed interval, number 3 of the partial reinforcement. Rewards are provided after a specific time period has passed. Reward given 20 seconds after a mouse presses down a lever. Example, selling cars and getting paid every 2 weeks. Variable interval, number 4. Rewards to a response are provided after an unpredictable time period has passed. Example, a reward given 3 minutes after a mouse presses a lever, then 2, and so on. Continuous reinforcement, the fastest way to establish a response. Partial reinforcement, the response becomes more resistant to extinction. Example, gambling. Shaping through successive approximation. This is done in order to elicit a certain response that may not be naturally possible. Example, wanting a monkey to open up a door. First, you give the monkey food for just looking at the door, then touching the door, and so on. Operant conditioning is limited though, since it is dependent on 2 behaviors, innate behaviors and cognitive processes. Innate behaviors, developmentally fixed. Example, the red stickleback fish attacks anything that is red. Cognitive processes, association learning for non-instinctual behaviors. This depends on the species' ability to recognize cause and effect. But there are biological constraints. This is why it's possible to condition a monkey to open a door since they recognize cause and effect. Observational learning. Observational learning is based on modeling. Example, imitating another person's actions. Children acting more violent when they see violence on TV. Observational learning shows children what is socially acceptable. Observer must have novel intelligence that can recognize the novel behaviors of others. This includes the use of mirror neurons. Mirror neurons help humans understand the actions of others. Vicarious emotions, the feelings of the emotions of others in order to learn from the success and failure of others, a major part of mirror neurons. 2.3 Lecture, Behavior in a Biological Context. Behavior is the sum of coordinated responses of organisms to internal and external stimuli that they experience. Maladaptive behavior makes it less likely that the species will reproduce and pass on genetics. Verbal communication, the transfer of knowledge. Nonverbal communication, actions. Animal signals, vocalizations, visual stimuli, touch, and smell. Social behavior, all interactions taking place between members of the same species. Attraction, aggression, conflict and competition between individuals. Attachment, forming relationships. Social support, finding help through social connections. All four of these, attraction, aggression, attachment, and social support, are all parts of social behavior. Foraging behavior, a set of behaviors animals use to find food. The goal is to optimize foraging behavior while maximizing energy gained. Teamwork can make foraging easier. Example, humans hunting a mammoth. Mating behavior, the behavior concerning the propagation of a species through reproduction. Mate choice, determined by a number of factors including judgment of genetic quality, overall health, and parenting skills. Altruism, helping others at risk of your own survival. Developed due to inclusive fitness. Altruism and inclusive fitness are connected. Inclusive fitness, offspring of relatives with similar genetic makeup. Game theory, use of mathematical models to represent complex decision-making in which actions of other group members must be reviewed. Under this, success of the individual depends on the strategies of other players. Alloparenting, giving the mother rest to forage through babysitting. Again, this is alloparenting. The prisoner's dilemma, both either confess or stay silent. This is an example of behavior. A shorter sentence will be for both if they stay quiet. The betrayer will go free. If both confess, both will go to prison. Next lecture, 2.4, Behavior in a Social Context. Elements of social interaction. This revolves around communication and cooperation, group dynamics, and power differences. The smallest groups. There are two, dyad and triad. Dyad, 2 people. Triad, 3 people. There are 5 group types. First type, primary group. Relatively permanent, intimate situations among a small number of people. Example, families and close friends. Dyads and triads are primary groups. Second group, secondary group. Impersonal relations among larger groups. More goal-oriented and less permanent. Example, a sports team. Number 3, social networks. Webs of weaker social interactions. Example, friends of friends. Organization. Groups of individuals working towards a common purpose. Number 5, bureaucracy. Formal organization. Max Weber's ideal characteristics of a bureaucracy. Number 1, clear hierarchy. Number 2, written rules and regulation. Number 3, impersonal and impartial. Sociological perspectives on bureaucracy. Number 1, the iron law of oligarchy. This criticizes the hierarchical nature of bureaucracy. People at the top want to stay at the top, even if that means compromising bureaucratic goals. Number 2, McDonaldization of society. The effect of the bureaucracy on stores being predictable, uniform, and efficient and automated. This means the loss of originality and creativity. Aspects of collective behavior. Fashion. A social pattern observed over a long term. A fad. A social pattern with a quick rise and fall in popularity. Mass hysteria or moral panic. Collective behavior in which a group feels a real or imagined threat to society. Riot. A group of people feeling threatened, which grows in frustration to the point of violence and destruction. This can be exacerbated by media. All social interactions are governed by social norms. Number 1, role. The expected behavior in a situation. Number 2, role conflict. A boss might also be the friend of a subordinate worker. but may also need to fire him. Role strain, too much work, management innovation, event organization, etc., doing too much work. Role exit, where an individual stops identifying in a particular role. Example, a boss is so frustrated with all the tasks and the need to fire a friend that she quits her job. Status. There are two types of status: ascribed status and achieved status. Ascribed status, given at birth. Example, gender, race, and socioeconomic status. Achieved status, what a person intentionally earns. Example, professional athlete, doctor, boss, and so on. Detecting meanings and intentions. Number 1, express of emotion. Number 2, detecting emotions in others. Both are kept to achieve good social interaction. Gender and culture greatly influence the portrayal and interpretation of emotions. Self-presentation and how they are perceived. There are 4 ways of self-presentation. Number 1, impression management. Changing behavioral choices in order to create a specific impression. Example, social media. Again, this is impression management. Number 2, dramatological approach. Ongoing performance or self-formed and reinforced through interaction with others. Again, this is the dramatological approach. Number 3, front stage self. The player performs in front of an audience. The attempt is to give people a certain perception of their behavior. Again, this is the front stage self. Number 4, the backstage self. This is when there is no audience present. You can let go of conventions. This can be full of behaviors not appropriate for an audience. Again, this is the backstage self. Example, a doctor will have a different front stage self when speaking with patients, and a different backstage self when talking to friends and family. Next, social processes that influence behavior. Group dynamics. You act differently in a group than you would by yourself. Next term, groupthink, where group members agree for the sake of group harmony. Group members' self-center idea for the good of the group. This can lead to a decision that may seem unanimous, but is not. Groupthink can have disastrous outcomes, which is why presidents include people with varying perspectives on their panel. Example, as the sinking Titanic, that many thought was unsinkable. Next, group polarization. The attitude of a group towards an issue becomes stronger than the attitudes of a particular member. Peer pressure. Sitting down and studying instead of playing games because that's what everyone else is doing. Peer pressure is an extremely powerful motivator for social acceptance. Audience allows for better motivation. Social facilitation. Performing better when there are other people around, when the person is skilled in a practice. This has the opposite effect if the person is unfamiliar and performing in front of an audience. Diffusion of responsibility. People feel less responsible when a large anonymous group is present. This causes the bystander effect. The bystander effect causes outlookers to fail to assist a hurt person because the assumption is that somebody else will do it. When fewer people are present, it is more likely that somebody will come out to help. The belief that individual action is not critical is the hallmark of the bystander effect. Social loafing. When groups or members decrease own work and let other members of the group work harder, or get a free ride. The presence of more people can encourage more people not to pitch in into group activities. De-individualization. Loss of awareness of the individual values. Feels no responsibility for their own behavior. They just go with the group. This is sometimes desirable. Uniform to mask individuality. Though mob mentality is a negative aspect of de-individualization. It is de-individualization gone awry. Lecture 2.5, Behavior in a Cultural Context. Socialization. Different practices are considered accepted and normal in different cultures. Example, hosting house guests for more than a few days may seem burdensome to one group, but staying with friends for less than a month may seem rude in others. Social norms. The rules that community members are expected to follow. Agents of socialization. These include friends, family, schools, neighbors, religious institutions, etc. Social control. Individual imposes a set of rules to control the behavior of others. Example, parents disciplining a child. Other example, creation of laws. Conformity. The tendency of an individual to change their attitudes and opinions to align with other group norms. A normal phenomenon in social animals. Example, dressing like coworkers to work. Another example, driving on the correct side of the road. Obedience. Behavioral changes made in response to a command by an authority figure. This has been shown through Stanley Milgram's study of obedience. Here, an actor pretended to be shocked. An authority figure told the subject to shock them. All of them did, even to deadly levels, with terrifying results. Stanley Milgram's study of obedience is all about perceived authority. Deviance. Behavior that violates social expectations. Example, customers not paying. An example of deviance. Stigma. A negative social label. Stigma, ostracism, and other social punishments to keep people from following expected behavior. Perspectives on deviance. Strain theory. Deviance arrives when conflict between social expectations and socially condoned methods of achieving those expectations arise. Example, expectations of economic success deviate from socially accepted way of gaining wealth. Anomie. An individual loses their moral guidance due to pressures of pursuing social expectations. Again, this is anomie, an interesting vocabulary term. Differential association theory. Deviance arises from social learning. Individuals socialized will learn to be deviant. Labeling theory. Deviant behaviors are based on an opposing group that carries out those behaviors. Once a group or a person is labeled as deviant, then their actions will also be considered deviant. Culture. Transmission. The passage of a culture from one generation to the next. Culture diffusion. Spread of culture from one population to another, such as a country adopting the practices of another. Cultural diffusion has been increasing through the ability to travel, the internet, and through other means of transferring information. Assimilation occurs through a variety of means, including new language acquisition, knowledge of social roles, and rules of the newly adopted culture. Culture shock, the feeling of disorientation when encountering a new culture. There are 4 stages of culture shock. First stage, honeymoon phase, an initial period of excitement. Second phase, negotiation. Problems such as language barriers and homesickness may arise. Third stage, adjustment. Fourth stage, mastery. Reverse culture shock. When someone returns to their original culture after adapting to a new culture. Subculture. A culture shared by a smaller group of people. Multiculturalism. Valuing and respecting the differences in a culture. Harmonious coexistence of culture is a valuable goal rather than forcing everyone to follow assimilation. Again, this is multiculturalism. Popular culture. The most widespread cultural patterns of society. Example, movies and top 40 hits. Mass media. Mass media transmits popular culture. It exposes consumers to violence and reinforces stereotypes about race and gender. It can increase the threat of false information. Mass media has a huge influence on large groups. Counterculture. Groups who adopt cultural attitudes in opposition to the larger culture. Example, the hippie movement of the 1960s. Cultural messages delivered through less mainstream forms of mass media. Cultural lag. The time it takes culture to adjust to technological innovation. This can be seen when developing new medical technologies. Another example is the possibility of a designer baby. Lecture 2.6, Prejudice, Bias, and Discrimination. The goal of multiculturalism cannot always be achieved. This is due to ethnocentrism, the belief that one's own group is of central importance, including the tendency to judge other groups by one's own cultural standards. In contrast, there is cultural relativism, trying to understand a religion based on one's own terms. An example of this is a Jehovah's Witness not wanting a blood transfusion to save their life. Ethnocentrism would judge a person based on his refusal of blood, saying that's ridiculous. Cultural relativism would try to understand the religion from that person's point of view, from the Jehovah's Witness point of view. Ethnocentrism can result in misunderstanding and conflict. There are two reasons for this. In-group. Individual shares identity and feels loyalty to that group. Out-group. Does not identify with that group, so may feel competition or hostility. Bias. Individual favors the in-group and devaluates the out-group. Prejudices. Strict generalizations of other groups or categories of people. Processes that contribute to prejudice. Us versus them. Power, prestige, and class. Schemas. Organizing patterns of thought used to categorize and interpret information, thus shaping individual attitudes and perspectives. One type of schema is stereotypes. Unlike prejudice, stereotypes can be positive, negative, or neutral. Stereotype threat. Impaired performance encountered when presented with a negative stereotype about a group they belong to, basically conforming to the negative stereotype portrayed about that group, in a form of self-fulfilling prophecies. Again, this is stereotype threat. Discrimination, caused by prejudice, meaning there is unequal treatment of people, mediated by power, prestige, and class. Individual discrimination. One person behaves negatively towards another based on membership in a specific social group or category. Institutional discrimination. Social institutions to employ people based on social grouping. Women not being able to become clergy is an example of institutional discrimination. Discrimination is influenced by biological, social, and cultural factors, and it is a learned behavior that can be passed through generations. This is the end of Lecture 2, Relationships and Behaviors.